So, I think I can call this meeting to order. I'd like to begin with the following statement. Beginning by acknowledging that we are in Treaty 1 territory and the traditional homeland of the Métis Nation. Today on the panel with me, starting at the far end, is Richard Whitbread, followed by Maurice Terrien. Today we have Belen Rojo as our secretary, and the assessor today is Brittany Santucci. We'll be hearing applications for revision of the assessment roll in accordance with the Municipal Assessment Act. The matters for which revision is requested have been described in each application, and we will limit discussion to those matters. The statements that applicants or the assessor make at this hearing are sworn testimony, and anyone speaking to the matters must be sworn in. Be advised the comparisons of assessments of properties are not considered evidence of market value by the Board of Revision. The Board of Revision is appointed annually by Council and is independent of it and the state administration. It makes its decisions on the basis of the evidence provided at this hearing and issues a written order that will be mailed to all parties as soon as possible. Please note that the Board's decisions with respect to an application may be appealed to the Manitoba Municipal Board if the matter pertains to assessed value or classification, or to the Court of Queen's Bench if the matter pertains to the application of exemptions from taxation. Should you wish to appeal, information on how to do so will be included in the Board's order. With respect to the hearing process, I will confirm the matters to be addressed with each applicant following the swearing in. We will then have the assessor's testimony followed by questions that the applicant may have, and then the applicant's testimony followed by questions. Each side will have an opportunity to summarize if they wish. Once all the evidence about an application has been brought forward, the applicant may leave. The process will repeat for each item on the docket today. The session will close after all the applications have been heard, and the Board will deliberate in private and make its decisions. You will receive the order by registered mail as soon as possible. As information, all public hearings are live streamed, recorded, and will be part of the public record. If you have not already done so, could you please either turn off your phones or silence them? And we ask that you not make use of phones during the hearing unless we determine that it is necessary for the inclusion of some form of information. We will start then with the swearing in and move to our first item that has not been withdrawn or subject to a agreement.
Please state your full name.
Brittany Santucci.
And you said the evidence you represent the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth you represent. Please state your full name.
Chevrier.
And you said the evidence you represent the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth you represent.
I do.
Thank you.
So our first property is at 1150 Waverly Street, and Mr. Smith, the only matter at issue here is the amount of assessed value, is that correct?
Correct.
Okay. Then, Ms. Santucci, could you please begin?
Thank you. This is file number 19-536, roll number 03071, 584000, and the address is 1150 Waverly Street. This office building was built in 1971, and we have a leasable area of 20,450 square feet. If you turn to page 2, please, I have some aerial photos of the office building here. If you turn to page 3, just the request for income expense. No previous sales recently. Page 4 is my income workup. We have 4 premises here. We have one for 5,090 square feet at $12.69, one for 7,280 square feet for $12.32, one for 4,980 square feet for $12.71, and we have 3,100 square feet at $13.22, and the overall rent per square foot is $12.64. We have a vacancy loss of 5.5%. We are using the 2% expense, and we have an overall capitalization rate of 7.2%. The overall value here is $3,216,000. If you turn to page 5, I have my comparables listed here. I tried to pick some office space located close to the subject property. The average for my 24 comparables is $13.08, and my median is $13.04. If you turn to page 6, it's just the income value summary. Page 7 is the model-derived capitalization rates. Page 8 is just the Municipal Assessment Act excerpts. And then if we turn to page 9, we have the income and expense questionnaire that was submitted to us. It just shows that they do have an average percent of space vacant at 12.45 right now. That was for the 2017 year. If we turn to page 11, we just have a base rent of $247,470 and just a bit lower than what we used. We have the management fee, which is recovered. On page 12, for the non-recoverable expenses, I removed the leasing commissions because we don't normally include that, and I revised the NOI to be $181,673, which again is a bit lower than what we currently use for our model.
I'm sorry, where do I see that number you just gave us?
Oh, I had just revised it by taking out the leasing commissions. So I just added back the $18,120.
And so that number is then, could you repeat it?
$181,673 approximately.
And I'm replacing,
It was they had just stated on there is the 163, 163,553. And then I think for our overall on page 4, we're at 231,000 for ours, so there's a bit of a difference for the NOIs. If you turn to page 15, I just have the tenants in the building. The current lease is in place. The rent per square foot ranges from $10.65 to $14. The oldest rent sign being the lowest of the $10.65, and then the newest rent at the $14. And then if we turn to,
sorry, I'm just trying to digest what you're saying here. I'm a little slower than you.
Okay.
Did you say 14?
the newest rent sign, so the Unit C, the Manitoba First Nations, that one is the rent per square foot of $14. And if you turn to page 20, I have not inspected this building, and I didn't have any pictures from a recent inspection. These are just photos from a leasing advertisement, just to show some of the space in this building. If you turn to page 21, it's just the start of our the agenda information, which we provide on page 23 some additional cap rate evidence. The top 5 properties there would be for office. And on page 24, it's just our non-recoverable expense sampling, just to kind of go over how we've, our model is a bit different than previous years, and we no longer have the 5% non-recoverable expense allowance, or for management, it's now just the 2% non-recoverable expense allowance, which would be for expenses such as advertising, promotions, professional fees, structural repairs, and then we have the shortfall. So when analyzing our data, we did it a bit differently this year, and that's why we have the 2% non-recoverable expenses. And my recommendation is to maintain the 2020 assessed value of $3,216,000. Thank you. That's my presentation.
Thank you. Mr. Smith, questions?
Yes, just a few. We're not heavily in disagreement on rental rates or anything, but you had indicated that the most recent rent was $14, right? But that is for a 6-month term, is it not, for the most recent one? Okay. And the oldest lease carries through 2020?
Yes.
Okay. looking at page number 11 of, yes, 11 of your brief there. The actual vacancy for the building was over $30,000, correct? So it'd be
Yes.
considerably higher
Than what we
the
would
5.5?
Yes.
And then just on that, in that same section, if you look at page number 16, and this isn't a huge thing either, but the area leased, the actual leasable area as per the leases signed by the tenants, is shown as 20,388 on your page 16, is that correct?
That's what they provided, that's the area lease.
Okay, and we'll only do this once, I guess, with regard to the expense allowance and the non-recoverable issue. I do have some rebuttal on that. Let me just look at the back of the brief here just for a second. So your final page 24, there's a total of nine properties on this chart. Is this a review of a single year that has been done? Are you aware? Or?
From my understanding, they reviewed 3 years. It would have
Okay.
just been 1 year of income expense information.
I see. And in the right-hand column, I see a number of items have been removed from consideration there.
Yes.
Consistently, the leasing commissions have been removed, it appears.
Yes.
And then if there's tenant improvements, the city is, or tenant inducements, those have been removed as well.
Yes, and the asset management.
Okay. I do have rebuttal information on the non-recoverable issue. I'm not sure how and when you'd like to deal with that.
Why don't we go through the evidence from both sides and then we'll turn to the rebuttal?
Sure. Those are all of my questions, thank you.
Mr. Whitbread.
First question was answered already, but very small variance. Oh, sorry, I'll have to wait. It's for the applicant. My apologies. Nothing else.
Okay. Mr. Xenia?
Yeah, I'm looking at your page 12,
Yes.
where you revised your NOI
Yes.
to 181,673. And then your NOI on page 4 is 231. So that's quite a considerable difference.
Yes.
How much weight should we be putting on your review here? What I'm trying to say here is, what in all of this is considered valid to come up to your 181 versus your 231?
Well, the 231 is just the model generated, and then for the, what they've provided to us, the only thing that stood out to me is, that should be removed from what they added, was just the leasing commissions. So we are quite different. I'm not sure if they just had more repairs or anything that were quite different from ours, or for expenses, but it was just the difference of it being model drive.
Yeah,
compared to the actuals.
the income is fairly close.
Yeah, so just more
Except
expenses.
your vacancy
Yes.
is about double what is in your workup on page 4.
Yes.
The vacancy's at 30,000, your workup is using 14,
Yes.
so it's about half. So that's a
It's
difference
quite a big
there.
difference, yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Did you inspect this property?
I
No.
did not inspect
Did
this
you- I
property.
think you said that. I'm not sure I picked it up. And your cap rate is based on suburban B, I assume, on page 7?
And then just the rate, yeah, falls
Between
within
the range of 620 and 730, is that what you're using?
It would be, yeah, so like the lows would be obviously the 5.55, and then the high would be 9.5, and then I
Okay,
guess
you're
the
using that,
percentiles
okay, and then
would be near
you're,
the 80th.
so it's in that sort of range, okay? Looking at the square footage here to see what they've reported,
I think we're about 60,
it's close?
we're about 60 square, is it about 60? About 62 square feet off it.
I have one last question. It's on the rent. Now if I can find it. So you're on your page 15. You're $10.65, $14, $12.50, and $13.50. Okay. You've come up with $12.64. So these are all in place as of the 31st of December 2017, I see on page 15.
Yeah. And then the one space, it's just, hasn't been rented out.
But your rent is model driven, your 1264?
Overall for the 1264.
Yeah, okay, thank you.
Thank you.
That's all, Mr. Chairman, thank you.
And the rents on your comparables, the average 1308, 13.4 for the median, 0.04, is higher than what you actually come up with as the model rent.
Yes.
I'm still struggling a little bit with the 231 versus 181.
Yes.
You talked about the difference in vacancy loss. It had been modeled at 5.5. The actual amount that you're applying is how much in percentage and actual absolute value?
So ours is 5.5%. The actual is the 12.45%
12.45.
for what they've stated on that, yes. And then the difference.
And which is how much in absolute numbers?
So
Where are we?
let's see here. They list base rent vacancy costs is $30,540, and we have only applied to $14,221. So we're about $16,319 difference.
Between what
What the actuals are
the
versus our
actuals
model.
are versus the model.
Yes.
Okay, then I'm still a little lost on why you're now saying NOI is 181
That's what I revised it to, just for,
instead of 231.
or no, that's what just the actual state compared to what our, just our model is generated. So our model's higher than the actuals.
Oh, you're not saying you revised
Oh, no,
your
no, I'm just
valuation
stating
to
that
181. You're just
revising
saying
what the income statement
if you
shows.
took the
Yes.
actuals,
So
that's
then
what it would
the
be.
actuals are lower than ours.
All right. Sorry, I missed that point. I'm going to the end of your document, cap rate evidence. Could you go through this in a little bit more detail, please?
So we had just chosen some properties to kind of back up our model drive cap rates. I personally never came up with these numbers, they're just here to provide additional evidence. So I'm not sure how much more evidence I can provide on them.
Okay,
Just
so,
that they range from 5.1 to about 6.54% for the office ones we've provided.
and this is, then I take it a sort of a boilerplate page that will hereafter be appearing in all of the
In all of our
commercial.
briefs, yes.
And since we're dealing with office, it's only the top table
Just the
out of
top
the 4
table.
tables that has any application.
Yes.
And what we're looking at then is 5 property sales between May of 16 and 6th of April 18?
Yes,
Why 6th of April 18?
I am unsure.
And so then instead of, or in addition to looking at your general table of cap rates and their spreads,
Yes.
this is particular backup, all of which are lower than the amount that you've actually chosen.
Yes.
And so why was the amount that you have chosen relied upon rather than these numbers?
Well, these ones, I guess they're more site, like, these ones would be site specific more, so the property we have today is a suburban office, like larger office building, built in 1971, and our cap rate would be based on some of those parameters compared to, I don't have.
So this is not office suburban, like the other page splits down office into subcategories, right?
Yes.
You know, A, B, C, that sort of thing. What are these relative to that page and how it splits them up?
These were just the 5 sales we picked. I think we only have 3, well, 2 that would be suburban. I'm not sure where the Notre Dame Avenue would fall. I think it would be suburban as well.
Okay, just looking at the,
Yeah.
And so that's where these would fall. There would be the Henderson as suburban
And then the Roblin,
and the Roblin
yes.
at 510 and 607. Okay. Then looking at the non-recoverable expense sampling,
Yes.
you're saying this is from 3 years going back from the reference date, is it?
Yes, they would have looked at income and expense mailers that were previous 3 years, I guess 17, 16, 15.
And are these addresses chosen because they are similar to the subject property, or is this again a boilerplate that
Again,
will serve for all?
This will serve for all of our briefs, and it was kind of done in rebuttal to, I think, the Altus properties provided.
Okay. Can you give us the theory briefly behind removing leasing commissions, asset management, and TIs?
That would have been based on just previous decisions through the municipal board and case law that we don't use those. And that would be kind of the explanation why we don't include them in our analysis.
Okay. All right, that's all my questions. These, I always think about this afterwards, but thank you. Mr. Smith, your evidence.
Yes, thank you. So 1150 Waverly Street. We are dealing with suburban office property built in 1971. And it does have an actual leasable area of $20,388. Not a great deal of difference, but that is what the actual leases that are being paid on are shown as. So the property has been measured as such, and that is what the tenants are paying their rent based upon. Looking at my brief here, you can see some photos of the property beginning on page 2, a few of the exteriors. Then we move into the interior. Some of the units have been more recently done, such as the hub space being shown on page number 4 there. You can see it has newer carpet and lighting, etc. And then obviously there are some older ones, such as the Women's Resource Center space that where the lease started in 2010. I don't know that there was actually any improvement done to that when that lease was struck, because the improvements are actually fairly old within that unit itself. So the lease is representative of what they are leasing, and it does carry forward through the 2020 year as well. So well beyond the valuation date of April 1, 2018, and indeed into the next assessment cycle. The description of the building is shown on page page number 6, again, there is a variation between individual units in terms of the build-out, as you can see from the photos. The site itself is shown on page number 7, being built in 1971, I believe. The building or portions thereof were not all office over the entire course of its history, but it is that way now and has been for some time. The location is shown on page number 8 in the southwest of Winnipeg, and we can move on to the valuation itself. So our main points of difference here lie in vacancy and non-recoverable expenses, but I will briefly go through the rest of it as it is all tied together. The subject property leases are shown at the top of page number 11. You can see the dates of the lease, size, the term, and their net rates, and they're varying between $10.65 and $14. One thing to note, Unit C, the 5,090 square foot unit that has an education tenant in it now, that property was vacant for the first 6 months of 2017, as well as all of 2016, and I believe it began in October of 2015, if I'm not mistaken. So there has been significant vacancy at that property over the prior 3 years. They have had some vacancy prior to that time frame as well. So that is certainly an issue that has cropped up with this property over time. And indeed there in the southwest there's a significant amount of competition for office tenancies in that neighborhood as well. So when you have an older building such as the subject with not necessarily the same amenities or build out, it won't necessarily draw tenants in the same way that some of the newer product or more renovated product will. The rental comparables are at the bottom of page 11. In our valuation, and pardon me, at the top of page 12, we also supply our own Cushman and Wakefield 2018 or second quarter of 2018 office market beat publication. This gives you statistics on vacancy and average rents for particular types. We're looking at essentially a Class C suburban property here, and the average net rent in that period was $11.61 for Class C suburban office space. So let's look at what the property actually brought in. If we look at the middle of my page number 12, the building as fully rented for the entire year in 2015 would have generated $244,195. They had that vacancy in the 5,090 square foot unit beginning in October, so they ended up with a vacancy of 10,180. So they brought in $234,000 in that year. 2016, that unit was vacant for the entire year, so 100% occupancy would have been over $250,000, $61,000 in vacancy. They actually brought in $189,091, and in 2017, the unit did lease eventually, but they still had a vacancy of over $30,000, $30,540. So their actual revenue brought in was $216,930. So in reviewing the value and in following the model that we have for these valuations, I've still projected 100% occupancy, but we do need to take into account this significant ongoing vacancy that they have had in this property and appear to have over time as well. So the in-place rental rates have been relied upon. giving us $264,437 in gross potential income. Moving on to vacancy and expenses on page number 13. We provide you with the Cushman and Wakefield, Colliers, and C.B. Richard Ellis stats with regard to vacancy for office spaces. Again, we're looking at a Class C suburban property here, and we have Cushman with a vacancy rate showing of 8.1% and Colliers showing a vacancy rate of 16.2%. Suburban overall, 6.2% to 8.01% on average. So again, the vacancy for the subject property itself, that vacancy began in October 2015, carrying through July 2017, giving us a vacancy in 2015 of 6.25%, 25% in 2016, that being the whole year, and 12.5% in 2017. So you can see that it's not a not a space that that drew a lot of interest, and indeed they got a shorter term tenant in there in the end. So it's one that will likely come up again for this coming up. City of Winnipeg has a maximum allowable vacancy rate of 25% in its model. We have applied a 10% vacancy rate to the property. They have significantly more than that, but of course we're looking at it over a broader time horizon, so 10% is appropriate for the subject property given its history of vacancy. Moving on to the expense allowance. So the City of Winnipeg allows a 2% allowance in their model in the current year. The history of the expense allowance and the model with the City of Winnipeg is such that 2% was always assigned and explained as a structural allowance. Before this board numerous times. We're in agreement with a 2% allowance for structural for the expense side. However, City of Winnipeg's model formerly had a 5% what was termed a management expense allowance. This was a misnomer. It was never intended to represent property management as an expense. Management, as the term was intended at the time it was struck, was intended to encompass the non-recoverable costs that an owner would face in managing their property, essentially. And that was the intent of that particular portion of the expense allowance over time. This has been adjusted by the city in its current cycle. And they have eliminated this 5% allowance. So if you move on to my page number 14, the Appraisal Institute of Canada is the governing body of the property appraisal profession in Canada and is responsible for providing education to its membership through a partnership with UBC. That indeed is the body that I belong to, and many appellants here do as well. Standard appraisal textbook provided to its members is the Appraisal of Real Estate, 3rd Canadian edition, by the Appraisal Institute of Canada. And in reference to the income approach to value, as stated in that textbook in chapter 21, it says, the formula for the calculation of the net operating income is summarized as follows. Potential gross income less vacancy and collection loss, also known as vacancy and bad debt allowance, equals effective gross income less operating expenses that are paid by the landlord, stabilized annual expenses, equals your net operating income. So the reference in this case to operating expenses that are paid by the landlord refers to those expenses that are non-recoverable operating expenses. So expenses that are not recovered from the tenants through the terms of their lease, through standard operating expense recovery. So typically in a lease, when it's a net lease, you'll be able to recover the costs of and it does vary between leases, but typically you'll be able to recover your standard CAM area, common area maintenance, as well as property tax, property management, all of the typical things that are involved with running a building that would be required for tenants to occupy that space. The non-recoverable operating expenses are also standard to a building in that any investment owner of a property would incur these same expenses, generally across property types. And these serve to reduce the overall net operating income to the owner. That is why the Appraisal Institute of Canada states in its methodology that operating expenses paid by the landlord are to be removed from the effective gross income. So the standard non-recoverable operating expenses include expense categories such as, but not limited to, the following: professional fees, legal, accounting, other, asset management, which I understand that the city is questioning, landlord work. So this is work that the landlord itself would need to do, such as in some cases electrical or plumbing issues such as that, building components itself, HVAC, things of that nature, often that are required but aren't recoverable from the tenant. Leasing commissions. This is an important one. You can see that the city has removed it. So in the operation of a building, in order to draw tenants, one has to advertise that space and draw tenants to it, tour them through the property, negotiate the lease with the tenants, and strike a final lease deal and move the tenants into the space itself. This is obviously something that is done on a professional basis in order to get correct legal documents, get the proper tenants in there, vet them as far as the quality of the tenant and their capacity to pay the rent over the term of the lease, etc. So this is a professional fee that has to be paid. It's incurred by owners in across all spectrum of property categories in putting tenants into their space. They would not put those tenants into their space as effectively, as quickly, at the same rates that they do without having professional realtors doing their job and putting them in. So this is an expense that they have to incur, and that deducts from their income, from their net income for the property. We then have owner repair and maintenance, exclusive of structural repair. As I mentioned before, marketing. Tenant inducement. This would be items such as free rent, items of that nature. Now, in a circumstance such as, say, in Southwest Winnipeg or in many other circumstances, you'll have a great degree of competition for tenants in filling vacancies. Often you have to offer them tenant inducements. So not tenant improvements, but tenant inducements, such as we'll give you 3 months free rent at the beginning to get you up and going, and then your rent will kick in after that fact. If somebody else doesn't offer them that, then you often get the tenant, right? That is a cost that the owner incurs and is necessary for drawing tenants in many cases. If you look at the multifamily world right now, with a lot of competition, there's tenant inducements being offered all over the place as far as free rent in the beginning of terms. So this is a very common practice. Finally, we have credit checks and in some cases property management fees. Typically, property management fees will be paid by the tenant, but there are exclusions in many leases. Generally, if you look at government leases, property management fees are typically excluded, so this is a cost that is then borne by the owner themselves. So this is an example of the categories of expenses that the owner can incur, and they often add up to a significant amount. In reviewing this particular category, Stevenson Advisors did a 3-year historical review of properties where we had full access to year-end income and expense statements. If you look at the top of my page number 15, you can see that we conducted a study over the years 2016 through 2018 in order to determine the proportion of non-recoverable expenses as a portion of effective gross income. So looking at our table in the middle, I'll just run through this briefly for you. So on the right-hand column, you can see the number of properties that we had in our study for each of those years. So 45 in 2016, 53 in 2017, and 47 in 2018. We did 2 columns, as there's some dispute about tenant improvements as being included in the non-recoverables. So the column on the left-hand side represents the annual average of non-recoverable expenses without tenant improvements being included. And the column on the right-hand side is non-recoverable expense average with the tenant improvements included. So running through the columns there, you can see the tenant, or rather non-recoverable expenses for without tenant improvement included ranged from 13.5% in 2016, 11.4% in 2017, and 9.6% in 2018. Including the tenant improvements, we had a range of 14.2%, 13.4%, and 10.6%. The actual 3-year averages are shown at the bottom there of 11.5% and 12.7%. Now, with regard to tenant improvements itself, and this has popped up, so that's why I'm addressing it. The issue of whether one can deduct the cost of tenant improvements from the net rent that is payable by the tenant to bring it down to net effective rent is one that often arises. It's been indicated or treated by the board here such that the face rent is what is typically dealt with. So you're looking at a situation where the tenant improvement has been paid out by the landlord to build that space to the spec of the tenant. So they're now paying a rent based on that improved space, which increases the rent that they're paying. It's built into their rent. So the rent moves from what it normally would have been to reflect the cost of the tenant improvement over the term of their lease. They recover it through, they get that additional money through the rent that is paid. So the expense of that can't be reflected on that side. It does need to be reflected in the non-recoverable side on the other side. So the TI should be included in the non-recoverable operating expenses because it's included in the additional rent that the tenant pays. You get on the other side of the equation. So just wrapping that up, I know that's lengthy and we won't do that twice. Looking at our 3-year averages, we're between 11.5% and 12.7%. We're looking at a a review of a 3-year history on between 45 to 53 properties. Significant study with all of the detail required for all of these properties. We're well beyond the 5% that is typically allowed by the City of Winnipeg in the past. We're simply seeking the reinstatement of that 5% non-recoverable. We're not looking to push it on an individual basis to what specifically is being paid on a building or to these particular averages that we're showing here. We're simply seeking the reinstatement of that 5% non-recoverable as well as the 2% structural allowance that has always been allowed. I do not see any evidence showing that non-recoverable expenses have dropped from 7% overall to 2% in the marketplace in this particular time frame. So we don't believe that it's appropriate for the city to be adjusting their model in that way. The rebuttal evidence will deal with some other issues, but we'll leave it at that for the moment. Shortfall allowance. We're deferring to the city's $7 per square foot. The actual is ever so slightly higher, but we're using the $7 per square foot. Capitalization rate, we're not in great disagreement here. I believe that the specific nature of the city's cap rates in going point by point is a bit aggressive in terms of being so specific. So we're at 7.25% versus 7.2%. Our study is shown on page number 16. We give you the cap rates from the major market participants, basically ranging from 6.25% to 7.5% for the two classes that are shown by those agencies. Again, we'd be looking at a Class C property here, likely, but we're using a 7.25% cap. Our caps are shown at the bottom of page 16. Using our 7.25% cap, we give you the summary of our valuation on page 17, and we come down to a final market value of $2,856,000. You can see the city's valuation adjacent to that. And then on the right-hand side, the city's valuation for the 2018 year. The big discrepancies there are obviously the expense allowance dropping from 7% to 2%, the NOI increasing significantly between 18 and 20, and the cap rate, they have adjusted upwards to 7.2%. The addendum materials for the brief include the current cycle's 2017 income and expense. I provided the one prior to that as well so that you can support the vacancy that I've stated for that prior time frame. And then we have the various market reports that are referred to in the brief. And that is my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you. Questions, Ms. Chevrier?
Yes. The photographs for the subject property, were those recently taken?
Not each of them has been recently taken, but we have been through the property quite recently. The spaces that are shown still look as they do in the photos that are shown.
In regards to the management of the 5% non-recoverable, so even though you did do a study and the averages are higher, you're still opting to just go to the city's model of the 5% previously?
Yes, we're not, we're asking for the reinstatement of that, that non-recoverable expense allowance.
But not ask for more, even though your data shows it should be more?
We're not currently asking for more at this time, no. If you look at this subject property, I think the tenant, the leasing commissions alone were $18,000 in this current year.
And in regards to their non-recoverable expenses, if we were to remove the leasing commissions and then management's in there, but it's also recovered on a previous page, We would have a pretty low non-recoverable expenses of about $710 though. So it would be quite low for this property.
So 2 points there. We don't agree on the removal of the leasing commissions. It's a requirement.
Yeah.
And the management that is not recovered for a reason. It would be in one of the leases, so that's not recovered from a particular tenant.
Oh, okay, so,
I don't know what the detail there is, but it wouldn't be in that space if it were recoverable.
so the management that's recovered for $12,728 on the first page, that's just paid by a few tenants, and then the other one is the exact same amount is not recovered?
That would appear to be the case, yes.
Okay, just because all the tenants have management fee charged to their, I guess, rental rates there. Okay.
So I'm just looking for that particular page here. So we're looking at the same information. Yeah, it would appear that it's divided for some reason, but I do know that we specifically manage this property, so if it was recoverable, it wouldn't be included in the non-recoverable section.
Oh, thank you. In regards to your final value, that value is less than 2018?
It is very slightly less than 2018, but again, the circumstances really have not adjusted since that time.
And then, did you appeal the 2018 to the municipal board?
No, we did not appeal the 2018 decision to the municipal board, but again, if we look at the property itself, nothing has really changed here, and I see that the city's cap rate has increased over that time frame for the subject.
Yeah, our cap rate increase and our increase, okay. That's all my questions, thank you.
Mr. Whitbread?
Oh, I'm fine, thank you.
Mr. Chevrier?
Yeah, you say that the free rent and office inducements was part of that 5% recovery?
Absolutely.
But normally we get the rent and then it's usually adjusted at that point for the inducements, the free rents and so on, and we usually get, in my estimation, a revised rent because of those inducements or the free rent.
No, so in our...
I'm trying to just get my head around this.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's run through it. So I think we're maybe looking at it slightly differently. So if you look at, say, the year-end statement from the property, they're going to show the rent that they actually, not the rent roll, but the I&E. So income, expenses, they're going to show the actual rent that they brought in. So it would likely project the full rent and then have deduction for free rent period or tenant inducements as a line item there, as well as vacancy, etc. So you can see it broken out there. The actual rental rate is what the rental rate is, and in doing our projections, we base it on 100% occupancy, less the appropriate vacancy amount, etc. But that is assuming that that tenant is there, 100% of the time, less appropriate vacancy, without taking into account any free rent or other tenant inducements that a owner might provide to a tenant.
So it depends on the method that was used, I guess. I'm not sure I understand this correctly. On the page 11 of the city, which is part of yours too, which, well, you'll know it by heart, I guess. Repairs and maintenance, there was the maintenance repairs or salaries at 10,515. And I'll try and get your page, Trevor, I'm sorry.
No, that's all right.
Page.
I'm looking at the city's one here as well.
Okay,
That's
so it's the
fine.
same as yours.
Yeah,
Sorry, it's middle of the page. So that, it's got nothing to do with the 5%?
the maintenance salaries? No,
No?
no, that's a recoverable expense. If you look just above that, so top of the page is the income, they come down to total income, then they have expenses, and the line under that is recoverable expenses, and then they break it down by category. If you flip to the next page, there's a line that says total recoverable expenses, so that's where the recoverable ends. And then you have the non-recoverable following that,
Okay.
which they've addressed as professional fees, some portion of the management fee here, the leasing commissions, marketing, credit reports.
So the 12,728 is a management fee that is
Not recovered.
not recovered. But it forms, so that final figure at the bottom is sort of distorted, I guess, when we look at the 181. You know, I'm not sure I'm right here. I'm just trying to,
Understand, yeah, no, I get your point, certainly. So the, and it's not playing with numbers, they account for their properties, how they account for them, and typically they'll want to come down to their bottom line number, everything out, right? Often including mortgage interest and things like that, you'll see many times on these pages, right? So they come down to their net profit loss of 163,000 in this particular year, everything included.
so the 5% in my calculation anyway represents 11,898. Because I think you've combined it with the 2% there.
No.
In your workup on page,
Oh, yes.
you put a 7, you didn't break it down.
I didn't break it down, perhaps I should in the future, I guess, in my chart
Well,
there,
it
but,
makes it helpful so we see what that amount is.
right, fair enough.
So which page is
Well, it was on this final workup here.
Page 17.
Has he got a number on there? I guess I'm not reading things.
So my expense allowance, the 2% and the 5% combined comes to 16,660
Yeah,
as a figure.
yeah. Okay, it's just I worked out the difference. And one last question. So normally on the vacancy rate, we try to look at a 5-year average, but I see but that could go up to 25 on a 5-year average, but on 3-year average, I think seems reasonable what you're saying at 10% because it was 12% on those 3 years, correct?
It ranged.
12.16, I think you said.
Yeah, I think, and I have the figures for you here. If you look at page 13,
Okay.
so it was a 3-month vacancy in 2015, which was 6 1/4. Then it was 25% in 2016 because it was vacant the entire year, and then 12.5% because it was vacant for 6 months of the year in 2017. So that's that particular unit that they have challenges with leasing. Prior to that time frame, I believe there was some vacancy as well, which probably contributed to our reduction in the last cycle as well.
Okay, that's all I have, Mr. Chairman, thank you.
Forgive me, I'll start with some very simple questions. What does non-recoverable mean?
Non-recoverable means that they're expenses that they cannot recoup from the tenancies through the terms of their lease. So expenses that the landlord will incur in relation to the operation of the building that they can't recoup through the lease terms with the tenancies.
And why can't they load that into the leases?
Because they're not accepted as standard expenses that a tenant should pay for. The tenant is not going to pay for the leasing commissions to an agent that, that the owner hired to put them in place. They're not going to pay for landlord work. They're not going to pay for the marketing of that building. They're not going to pay for credit checks, tenant inducements they're receiving.
Yeah, I've seen the list.
Yeah.
But, sorry to cut you off, but
No, that's fine.
just try to shorten this up a little bit.
You bet.
And is that merely a case of accepted practice? Is there a legal reason why these are not loaded into the rents?
Is there a legal reason? Well, not being a lawyer, I can't specifically talk about the legal nature of it, but it is certainly accepted practice, and logically, if you go through the list, these are items that a tenant wouldn't agree to paying. So the practice emerges out of years of history, right, in which tenants are clearly not going to pay for items that are not of benefit to them, that should be borne by the ownership.
So if the non-recoverables are actually 11-12% as included in your table there, and I assume an owner has to recover all of its costs one way or another, where are those costs covered? By what means?
They're covered by the owner out of their income for the property. So
What other income is there other than what comes through the rents?
there is none. So those costs, again, are borne by the owner, and that's why there's the deduction from the effective gross income to bring it down to a net income.
When you value the property, okay, I understand that, but, sorry, I'm a little stuck on how is it that they never recover those costs? It seems to me you've said two things.
Okay.
The renters wouldn't agree to paying this. On the other hand, there's no source of revenue to pay for those costs. And if at 12% every year, you couldn't cover that, you run out of business eventually.
Well, so let's, I'll point to two things here just to explain it. And of course, I know time is moving here, so we want to keep this brief. So I will be efficient about this, but if we look at my top page number 14, and you run through the Appraisal Institute of Canada's formula, you can see where it's deducted. So after the effective gross income, then the deduction of landlord non-recoverable expenses is then deducted. So
And this is where the Institute describes how to do an appraisal.
Correct, in the income approach to value, yes.
And
That's the specific.
in an appraisal, there will always, of a specific property, there will always be the specific amount of non-recoverable expenses for that property? Or is there a general amount that is always used?
It can vary by property, of course, depending on what you're looking at. You have to be appropriate for them, but there's generally always an allowance that is made for non-recoverable expenses and structural allowance as well. That's
how much variation have you seen in that?
If let's say you had a situation where you had an industrial building, single tenant, absolute net circumstance or something of that nature, where the tenant is responsible for everything to do with that property. You don't plow, you don't do anything. They maintain everything. So that's the one extreme, right? That's extremely rare.
In which case there'd be nothing listed as non-recoverable expenses?
Well, you would be responsible for structural maintenance in that case. But again, that's I can't tell you how rare that is in the marketplace. To situations where you have gross and semi-gross leases and lots of multiple tenancies, and very high non-recoverable expenses. It does vary, certainly. Just to come back to your original point, and I think if we look at the city's brief here and the income and expense statement, so pages 11 and 12, this will probably answer it for you. So just the general layout will explain it. So we have income at the top, including their recoveries. So there are operating expense recoveries that they get from the leases. Then they have recoverable expenses. These are the expenses that are deducted. So you have your rent. That is then topped up by the operating expense recovery. So you get a gross amount, right? Then all of the recoverable expenses are deducted to bring you down. And then at the very bottom on page number 12, you have those non-recoverable expenses that they don't recover from the tenants, and that's still deducted from the revenue from the income side. So you go from, you had total income of $349,000, call it, deducting $153,000 in recoverable expenses, because those expense recoveries are included on the income side. So those are then deducted. Then you have the non-recoverable expenses that they don't recover from the tenants. That's still taken off. They still end up with a profit. So they're not going out of business. They still have a significant profit, and you can see that.
Where does the profit come from, though, if you can't recover 12% of your expenses?
Well, because the rent is enough to drive a return to the owner, otherwise they wouldn't purchase it, right? So if you look at the bottom here, we had 300.
So the rents are actually covering those.
We had base rent of $247,000, let's say, at the top of page 11 of the city's brief. Then the various other revenue sources, there's some parking, there's some, the CAM recovery, the property tax recovery, then some management fee recovery, and you end up with that gross figure of $348,981, right?
Mm-hmm.
Deducted from that, so you've taken the rent, added on the operating expense recoveries. Now you deduct the actual operating expenses that are recovered. So it's an in and out, right? They're paying for it, you deduct it, and then you have at the bottom the non-recoverable expenses. So we have $349,981 less total recoverable expenses of $153,868 less the total non-recoverable expenses of $31,559. That's all there.
Yep. Well, I can see that.
Yeah. So we end up with a net profit of $163,000. So it doesn't drive them out of business. It just reduces their actual net to the owner. So instead of 180, whatever they would have had, 194,000, they're getting 163,000 in this particular instance.
Okay, I'll leave that line of question.
Okay.
However, you have said that actual fact from that study is 11%, 12%, depending on whether TI is included or not. But you're willing to go with the city's former standard of 5%. I don't understand why.
Why we're not asking on an individual basis for each particular property? It would become onerous, I believe, if you were to look at each specific property, and it would also be misleading, because in some cases you would have a property that would have extreme non-recoverable expenses in 1 year, where they might have an exceptionally low net income, and if you were to capitalize that, it wouldn't represent a market value. So
okay, so that's the case if you every time looked at the individual property, but you've actually presented us with medians by year.
Mhm.
And it's those medians from looking at 40-odd, 50-odd properties.
Right.
They came up with the 11 or the 12. So why are you not taking that average or that median and saying, this is what the real world is?
Right.
Why aren't you doing that? But instead you're saying, okay, we'll accept 5%.
I suppose we could, and perhaps that might be something that we'll look at over the longer term. Is the 5% appropriate or not? But in the shorter term, we're looking at an adjustment to the model that's completely inappropriate and needs to be reinstated, and that's the primary concern at this point in time. On the longer term, perhaps we'll do a greater longer term study as well, with perhaps more years and more properties as they become available, and compare notes and determine what would be appropriate as an average if the 5% should be adjusted.
May I ask a question
Yes.
when you're done?
Yes, I am done. My apologies for taking the amount of time that I have on this, but
I
it's
should
an
apologize
important
first.
point,
It is.
and it's coming up frequently. So the more we understand the rationale, the better off we'll be. Mr. Whitman?
Well, thank you for sowing many more questions in my mind with your questions. But if I could just take it in a general direction along that same line.
Sure.
In a normal business model,
Mhm.
you would run a business and you would have expenses and you would have revenues. And typically you would have to increase your revenues to a point where your expenses were covered, or soon enough, not having an endless pot of money, you would go out of business. Is that not correct? If you couldn't increase your revenues.
Yes.
Yes. So in this case, you're telling us the rent is here and the tenant would refuse to pay certain expenses, so you've got to add them back in for some purpose at the back end of the financial statements. Is there a reason why your why your owners cannot simply increase that rent to cover those expenses?
Yes, because the market doesn't bear it. They can only charge what the market will bear as far as rent. So if they could get more rent, they would get more rent.
But what we're hearing in all of these meetings that we've been to this year is that every one of the employers or owners has those same expenses.
That's correct. They do
And
bear
so-
those expenses over the term. So-
What I'm struggling with is then why do all of the owners not change the market trend by increasing those rents?
Well,
Do you have an answer to that?
It's not, you can't move a market like that, I guess. The market is the market. So if I'm a tenant and I'm looking for a space in southwest Winnipeg, say, office space, and I have a choice of, I don't know, five units I'm shown by an agent, and I look at them and, you know, they're all $12, $13 or something of that nature, and then one of them is, you know, $15.50 with the same operating costs, etc. So your gross figure is, you know, $2 or $3 higher, and they're comparable. Well, I'm not going to go there, and
I understand.
the owners are not going to collude to push the market to what that is. It's the things that are excluded shouldn't be paid for by the tenants, and they wouldn't agree to paying those. And this isn't a Winnipeg thing. This is broad-based across it's accepted practice, and that's indeed why it's taught that way by the Appraisal Institute, and was followed by the city in their valuation model over time.
Tell me if this is not appropriate, Mr. Chair, because it wasn't addressed in a rebuttal this morning or in evidence, but the city has brought evidence forward relying on case law, I believe in 1995 and 1997, that disallowed this 5%. And in spite of that, they've continued to allow the 5%. Do you understand the rationale behind their denying that 5% in those cases?
So we're not looking at that evidence today, so
I appreciate it may not be appropriate, and I'm open to
Well, I think that what you could say about it that would help to educate the panel on the topic would be helpful.
Okay, on the understanding that it's not material that's here today, my general understanding, and again, I'm not looking at the particular cases, is that the the cases A went back considerably in time frame. They were decided a considerable amount of time ago, or they were of and I'm not sure how to explain this, and I was not involved in them, but they were of a trivial nature, or of something that shouldn't be taken as a broad brush. This is how the model should be done. And again, I am simply speaking from my understanding of what those particular cases were. We're not looking at them here today. So that's about as much as I can say in that regard.
Any other questions?
No further questions. Thank you.
Then we could turn to the rebuttal.
Okay, I will be exceptionally quick with this. It's a big document, but we can run through it in very little time, because I know that time is moving on here.
Will this be for all the items today?
Yes. We will only deal with it once. So if everybody's got the document there, so all I'm showing here is that consistently the city of Winnipeg, going back in time in their valuation model, has used a breakdown of the non-recoverable expenses in 3 phases essentially. I will point you to my page number 11, and you can see a highlighted portion. So there are 3 phases to this. There's the shortfall, which is the expenses the owner incurs on vacant space. That's always accepted. That's at the top of the page by the various categories there. Then what was termed management, which is not management, but was termed that. You have the 5% in the middle of the page, and at the bottom you have the 2%. This is the model that the city followed for 20 years or more, roughly. I think I was told that in 2006 the city of Winnipeg's multiple regression model came into play. This was used prior to that time frame as well, but they were indicating their model changed at that point. The 5% was still allowed prior to that, as well as the 2% other expenses. The 2% other was always explained in hearings here before the board in my presence that it was an allowance for structural maintenance of the building that the owner would incur that couldn't be recovered from the tenant, the structural component itself. So all I'm showing you here is the history of the city. This is 2012, 2016, 2018, all following the same model. And then as we come to page number 49 in the 2020 year, suddenly we have a removal of 5%. Which had been termed management. Now, it's not management. We all know that typically, and current building aside for the moment, typically property management is recovered from tenancies in their leases. There are cases, such as the current one, and many government tenancies, etc., where you do not recover the property management, but generally you do recover it. So it's not a property management allowance that is suddenly taken out because the city realized that, oh, they do recover that. It's a non-recoverable expense that was always intended to be allowed for the owner for non-recoverable expenses in managing that property, not property managing it. Following that, we have evidence from other jurisdictions in Canada, that being Ontario and Saskatchewan, showing their models with regard to the income valuation. If you look at page number 57, Ontario specifically allows the deduction of typical non-recovered operating expense allowances. We move on to Saskatchewan. They have the same. I have not gone beyond those two jurisdictions. I do not believe that it would be significantly different in jurisdictions where they use income valuation as their main model. Page number 69, again, specifically refers to deduction of non-recoverable operating expenses in Saskatchewan. More importantly, perhaps closer to home, immediately following page 72, this is a property I just represented in the city of Brandon before their board of revision with the province of Manitoba. On the other side of the table, you can see their model in the following page. And in the model there, they have deduction for vacancy allowance, they have a deduction for what they're terming management, and then they have a deduction for other. Management was at 5%, other was at 2%, and then they have their shortfall rate following that. That's still in play in the 2020 year. That's the province of Manitoba's assessment department itself. And at the very end, we have specific decisions that refer to the re-inclusion of the non-recoverable 5% in decisions before this board in the current cycle. That's, again, 3 properties at the very back of the brief here today. And that is my rebuttal. Thank you.
Question?
Yes. So on your page 11, you're saying that in the city's document here that they are they're missaying that management is not management, it's actually non-recoverable, even though it says here it's management.
Well, that's the term that the city has used.
So the city's
yes.
used the wrong term. And then for the other expenses, that those are structural and non, like I'm just kind of confused because it doesn't say they're for just structural, it says other expenses.
No, and I do see that. So what I was indicating, I guess, is in doing my work here before the board for the last over a decade now, it's been presented by many assessors to the board in my presence that the 2% other is a specific allowance for structural non-recoverable expenses for the ownership, and that is what that is representative of. So I'm fairly certain that they didn't come up with that on their own, and that they were conveying what the model was intended for and what they were told.
And then on your page 59, you pointed out that that non-recoverable operating expenses should be removed. But you do agree that we are removing 2%, or just not removing a total of 7% now. So the real difference here is 7 versus 2, not that we're not necessarily doing it.
Well, I think the real difference is that the city is not recognizing the full scope of non-recoverables, and that's why they've moved from 7 to 2, and that in relation to other jurisdictions as well as the province and appraisal theory itself, it doesn't agree with what has been done.
Okay. On page 61, you have an example one that shows the -5 for non-recoverable expenses. So that would, this is obviously example, but that would be less than the 7%. Do you know what other provinces are using for their model derived non-recoverable expenses? If they're using a 7 or a 2 or a 5?
I don't have their specific models itself for these jurisdictions, and as you said, these are examples, so I can't specifically say whether these are the amounts that they use, but it is what they presented in their example. They may be different from that, they may be higher.
Okay. And then you pointed out the province is still including the management. But there's a difference between how our models were derived from the province and the city. Because if we were to now put the 5% back in, we would now be distorting our model. Because our model's based.
Is this a question or
Or yeah,
part
I guess
of
like
your
it's,
response?
sorry, I guess like wouldn't you say it would distort it to put it back in?
No, I think it would bring it back into balance.
Okay. And then you just included some other current board orders, that's all? So, okay, that's all my questions. Thank you.
Mr. Whitcomb?
So I'm trying to understand this still. Using the 2%, if there were no structural expenses for 10 years, and maybe that's naive on my part, but say there was 0, is it fair to say then income would be understated by 20% over that time because you've not incurred 20 or 2% for 10 years, but you put it on the books? And how do you account for that then?
Right, so I do understand your point, but the reasoning for the allowance is that in typical situations, and again, across the board, not just in Winnipeg, but in other jurisdictions as well, you do incur these expenses. It's not every year, you know, you're not necessarily going to have to replace a roof every year or underpin the foundation or redo the parking lot or what have you. But over time, those will pop up. So you may have a $400,000 expense in, you know, year 7 and nothing in the prior 3 years or something of that nature, right? So the averages are there for a reason because they've been borne out by market evidence over time. So I do follow your point, but the market shows that these expenses do happen on a general basis across categories for owners.
Because the same thinking could occur then, could it not, using the 5%? Your 50% over 10 years understated on your income.
Right, so, and again, it's a situation where you look at what the norm is in the marketplace. So having done our study, it gives you some evidence of that on a 3-year time horizon. But if you look at a bigger study of more properties on a greater, longer scale, you know, the numbers probably will be similar to what we showed you, but they won't be under 5%. Certainly, these are conservative estimates. So, you know, you put a tenant in for 5 years. Say you have a 2-unit building. You have 1 vacancy. You put a tenant in it. They're there for 5 years. You don't have a leasing commission again on that unit for, you know, another further 5 years. But you have a big one in that first year, and the other items as they come up, tenant inducements and whatnot.
Maybe you can comment on this. Having done quite a number of buildings this year with this process in play, and only having a 1-year snapshot typically on the actual income statements, I haven't seen huge structural expenses outlined in the expense statements. One would think they would be pretty significant if they're structural, likely in the tens at least to the hundreds of thousands of dollars.
Right.
And so we don't get that accurate picture, do we, that you're talking about, that broader picture. We're not getting that, taking a snapshot of 1 year at a time.
If you only see the 1-year income and expense statement, yeah, it can be difficult, I guess, to wrap your head around it. What I generally do on the operating expense side, where we calculate those out, is I'll give you that 3-year history. That's more prevalent in multifamily, in that I present the 3 years for you. But I believe in this one, I think I showed 2. If you look at the single year, I think we're at 30,000 in non-recoverables or something of that nature. So, but I do get your point.
Thank you. No further questions.
Mr. Tilley?
No, I have no questions, thank you.
Just for clarification, so your point in the rebuttal is that the 5% has been applied in addition to the 2% historically and ought to carry on, and other jurisdictions are applying 5%, and therefore we should be accepting that as the logic behind applying it here too.
In addition to the studies that we ourselves have done as well as other appellants presented here before you today, the appraisal theory that backs it up, the other jurisdictions, it never should have been removed in the first place.
Then the last question I would have is appraisal theory and practice and assessment theory and practice immutable?
Immutable?
Should it never change?
It's an interesting point. Should things never change? Well, that would depend on markets and in general, I think the basic theories of appraisal methodology as well as assessment, which is tied to appraisal, are there for a reason. They've evolved over time to reflect how properties are operated and what returns are to owners, etc., what true market value is and how it's derived. So I think we're at a point where, you know, we're not in the 1950s or anything. We've evolved to a point where things are pretty set as far as how things should be done. I think it would be, and take this as my final point, I find it highly unlikely that the city would make a 5% error on their modeling across the board for all commercial properties in Winnipeg from 2006 through 2018. I just don't see that as being a remote possibility.
Okay. A response to the rebuttal?
I guess that we just follow the IAA standards at the city with our assessment to sales ratio, and we believe that our model is correct. What we've made changes to.
Any questions of the assessor? Or statement?
No, thank you.
That's all, thank you.
Can you say specifically what the IAAO standard might say? Any of their standards, particularly ones with respect to income approach, or IAAO textbooks? Or since you're talking about the education material from the Appraisal Institute, the UBC assessment information, what do those sources say about how to address non-recoverable items?
Well, there's no set parameters for non-recoverables. Like with an appraisal, again, it would be a bit more site-specific, whereas the model is an overall. And then just in regards to IAAA, they set parameters between 0.9, I think, and 1.1, and we fall within those parameters for our assessment to sale ratio. So.
All right. Thank you. Presumably, we won't have as many questions with respect to the next property.
Have a break now, Mr. Chairman?
Yes, let's take 5 to 10, and then we will resume. All right, we can carry on with 1475 Chevrier Boulevard. Ms. Entergy.
Thank you. This is file number 19-1499, roll number 03091, 248500, address 1475 Chevrier Boulevard. This property here was built in 1979. It's 2 stories with a basement, and the leasable area is 15,642 square feet. If you turn to page 2, you can see the property on the lot. It actually is quite a large lot, and the building's on the left side of it, facing Chevrier. If you turn to page 3, we have some older interior photos. If you turn to page 4, we just have the receipt response for the request for information, and then there's no subject sale history, and then in regards to subject property leases, they're gross leases, and I'll speak to those in the income and expense statements. On page 5, we have the first income stream here. This is for the office portion. So the first premise we have is the basement premise, which is the 4,236 square feet at a rental rate of $3.40 per square foot. We have the other space is the 4,584 at $13.49 on the main, and then 4,446 square feet on the second at $12.86. So the overall rent per square foot is $10.06. We have a vacancy loss of 5.5%, expenses of 2%, and an overall capitalization rate of 6.7%. If we turn to page 6, I have some rent comparables. So the first 1 to 24 are for the office space on the main and second floor. Those range, or the averages are $13.08 and then $13.04 for the median. For my basement comparables, these would be superior. A few of these, such as 226 Osborne and 1483 Pembina, are bi-level basements. I've also never been in this basement. From what the notes I read, it was, I guess, outdated. The average for my basement comps are $9.23 with a median of $9. On page 7, I have a separate income stream for the storage warehouse in the rear of the building. This leasable area is 2,376 square feet, and we have a rental rate of $8.79 per square foot. So for this income stream, we have a vacancy loss of 2.5%, expenses of 2%, and an overall capitalization rate of 6.3%. For my rent comparables, I used storage warehouse comparables close to the subject property, except for the comparables 7 and 8, and those are actually located just south of there. They range from $7.27, and they go up to $12.48. I noticed some of the older ones were actually higher. My average is $9.99, and my median is $9.95. On page 8, I just have the income value summary, which shows the combined potential rent of $154,000 approximately, and we have a net operating income combined of about $138,000, and the blended capitalization rate of 6.64, and then our overall value of $2,081,000. On page 9, we have our model derived capitalization rates and Municipal Assessment Act excerpts. And on page 11, we have the 2017 income and expense questionnaire. I'll just point out here, this is gross. The one thing that stood out to me on this one was that the property management and its administration was extremely high. I'm not sure, there's no maybe explanation for that. Look into that. The average space vacant was also higher than what we've applied. There's actually 28% vacant. And then it shows they have 45 parking stalls, but it doesn't state they receive any income for them. I'm assuming they're included in the leases. On page 13, we have the tenants that are currently occupying this building. Again, these aren't net leases, they're gross. Right now, we have 11,232 square feet occupied, and then the monthly rent is $14,583. So there's about actual vacancy 4,410 square feet. On page 15, again, it's just my agenda that I've gone through that shows on page 17, the additional cap rate evidence, 18, the non-recoverable expense sampling. And my recommendation for today is to maintain the 2020 assessed value of $2,081,000. Thank you. That's my presentation.
Mr. Smith.
Yes, so I'm looking at your page number 5, the workup for the office space.
Yes.
So this is all model driven, correct?
Yes.
So the rents that are applied here are model driven, the 1349 and 1284 186 for the above ground. So those would be driven by age, location, et cetera.
Yes.
They wouldn't take into account the condition or age of the finishings, correct?
It would be of other
That's
market
right.
rents depending, so it wouldn't be, based on a few site-specific parameters, it would be based on not the specific condition, I guess, of this.
Right. So it wouldn't necessarily reflect what the interior of the vacant space is like, et cetera.
No.
Okay. And the $8 a square foot for the pardon me, for the storage warehouse. The warehouse portion of this property is attached to the office component, right?
Yes,
And it's located at the rear of the building?
yes.
Do we know the situations of any of the comps there? And I know it's difficult to obviously see all comps, so I don't really expect to know each of them in detail, but are any of them of a similar nature? Niagara has probably got a good profile, I would imagine. That's where I'm thinking it is, just at number 1 and Lajmoje.
Well, that one's smaller, so that's also why it has the higher net per square foot, I think, for that one. But that was closer to the subject property, and then I tried to pick some of the ones that were even farther away that maybe were a bit more reflective of even though they weren't as close. I tried to do it based on age
Okay.
and size.
Those are all my, you did mention that it is gross rents that are in
Yes.
place there? Okay. Those are all my questions, thank you.
Mr. Whitbread?
No, I'm fine, thanks.
Mr. Chevrier?
Yeah, I'm looking at the cap rate, and it's a 1979 building, and you've got two rates here, 670 and 630, and then you combine for 664. I see the previous building we looked at, 1971, was 720. Where's the cutoff between the rates we have today and the 1971 building, because it's in the same?
I'm thinking it could be due to the overall size of the building. That can also be effect on the cap rate.
Size?
The size of the building also is taken into account. I know when part of it is obviously the account's rebuttal, but in
Because
our
it's-
breakdown of our general model, I'm not sure if it breaks down on how each capitalization rate for even a year can be.
This was all model driven too, both
All of it's model driven,
income streams,
yes.
the whole bit?
Yes.
Okay, that's all I need to know, thank you.
The warehouse part, is that, when I look at the photos, that's that lower area at the back of the building
Yes.
that is neither 1-story nor 2-story?
It's a bit taller, like if you look on the front page of the account, or actually even on page 3 of mine, you can see in the rear there's like some truck doors,
Yeah.
I guess it would be higher.
Right. And this is essentially all one operation, and the office part relates to the warehouse, it's the same business?
Currently, yes, and I think that's kind of what it was probably built for to originally be, based on the size of it, not maybe multi-tenanted at all.
Okay. Is there anything unusual about the proportion of office to warehouse and that sort of thing that would make this a very attractive building, or alternatively one that would be a little less attractive on the market?
I'm not sure, I haven't really haven't dealt with too many properties where office ones where they have a warehouse portion on the back, so I'm not sure if that would make a huge difference.
So this would seemingly be, unlike fair number of places that are warehouse with some office. This is the alternative. This
Yeah.
is office
More
with some
office,
warehouse.
some warehouse in the rear, yeah.
Okay. All right, those are all my questions. Mr. Smith?
Thank you. I'll get you to look at my page 9 to start with. Gives you the property location. So we're looking at, wait till you guys get there. So we're looking at 1475 Chevrier. It is in Fort Garry industrial area. So we're looking at predominantly in an office building in a non-standard office location, which, as you can tell, yes, it's in Southwest. No, it doesn't front on Waverly or on McGilvery or Buffalo, which is the adjacent or parallel street to McGilvery there. You get no profile from locating in this particular location. That's one thing to keep in mind. As you were getting out there, the property was originally built for a single occupant as a grain, I believe it was a grain company, back in 1971, and they were the occupants owner occupants for quite a long time. That has changed, and it hasn't changed recently. It changed a while back, and it was multi-tenanted in the building itself. Let's flip back a bit here. There's a bit of detail on my page number 1. I'd like to draw attention to. So we did appeal a property in 2018, and it was reduced to $1,668,000. We have appealed that decision to the municipal board. We're awaiting scheduling for that. The total leasable area is actually slightly off there. It's a little lower than that. You can just see just the basic details of it. Looking at the building itself, you can see it is of its vintage in terms of the exterior. On page number 2, we've got a picture of the lot as well. And then we get into the interior. So I'm sure these, and I'm not sure, oh yes, they did include a few more. I'm sure the lovely wood accents were beautiful when they were installed in 1971 for the tenant, the owner. You look at the bottom of page 4, top of page 4, bottom of page 3. This is the main floor. This is the space that is vacant. If you're a tenant in the marketplace for space of that size, this building in its configuration or in its finishes as it is in its location is not going to be a big draw for you. It's dated, it's worn, it's off-center, it gives you no real profile. So that is the vacant space we're talking about. Then we're looking at the warehouse at the back of the property at the bottom of page 5 as well as 6. So the warehouse is a unique component. It was, as I said, originally a single tenant occupant building, so they had a need for that. It ties into the building through stairwell, etc. Not every office user needs a warehouse component, so it's a bit of an odd deck. It is located at the rear of the building as well, and it's a relatively small space. So again, you're not getting any profile. Not that all warehouse users need profile, but it's not a high demand space or front and center certainly. The height of it as well, I'm not sure if I included that overall here, but I believe it's about 16 feet on the exterior. Hopefully I included the property attributes at the back, but I believe that's roughly what we're looking at, so it's somewhat lower than the market averages certainly. So let's move into the valuation. The leases for the property are gross. I've indicated this on my page number 12. You can see the leases that are in place. Currently, there's a different a different agricultural tenant, Cantera, that has taken 3 of the spaces, including the warehouse. So they are in the basement space, the second floor space, as well as the warehouse, and they're paying a gross annual rent of $175,000, which comes out to $15.57 a square foot gross. When you deduct their proportional share, so taking out the vacancy, if you deduct their proportional share of the actual expenses of $150,000+, it brings you down to a net effective rent of 96 cents. Now, as the assessor had mentioned, there is a very large property management fee that is included in those expenses, so I'm not going to say 96 cents is exactly what it should be, but it's going to be a lower, certainly a lower overall rent, and you're going to be under $10. I would certainly project well under $10 on a net basis. So we have applied rental rates as shown at the bottom of page 12. The basement space, we've applied a $5 a square foot net rental rate as a market value. The main floor, which is the very dated office space, we've applied an $8 a square foot rate. And the second floor, which has been improved, we've applied a market average of $12 a square foot. To the warehouse, we've used $6 per square foot. Our rental comps for these are on page number 13. So we tried to be as close in size and location or similar locations as possible. So the top of the page gives you office comps. We have rents ranging between $9 and $14 a square foot. $14 being at a higher profile building at 525 Academy. We have an office rent in a 2012 built building at 1020 Lorimer in the southwest, a flex warehouse office space. Basically, these are some quasi-retail tenants in here. Starting date of 2015, $12.50 a square foot there for 2,204 square feet. I think that's, we can run through all of them if you wish, but I think if you look at 1020 Lorimer, your rent is certainly going to be less than that. We've applied $12 to the second floor space because it has been renovated and changed. The main floor, it remains as it is. We've applied $8 a square foot, representing the draw of the finish that you have there. The rental rates for the warehouse are shown at the bottom. $6 a square foot is certainly, it's a smaller space, so your rent will generally be slightly higher if it's in a decent location and not terrible space. Balancing that, it's at the back, it has no profile, etc. So these rents that I'm showing you here are certainly appropriate for the subject property. Given its location in the southwest, we've even added a premium above what we're showing here in the warehouse rents and applied $6 a square foot. $8 plus a square foot rental rates you see on modern, new, recently built warehouse properties, flex type space. That's not what we're dealing with here. So the summary of all of this, we come to a potential gross income of $125,058 using market net rental rates. Vacancy stats are shown on page number 15. These are the office stats. The subject property had a 28.2% vacancy. This is ongoing. We have applied, in this case, a 7% vacancy for the property. We could have potentially used a greater vacancy a greater vacancy rate and perhaps a slightly lower cap rate to balance it out. That's one way of dealing with this. We've applied what we feel to be a regular suburban vacancy rate of 7% based on the stats, and the additional vacancy risk and experience that they have with this building is part of the reason for the 7.5% cap rate. Our expense allowance statements remain the same. We won't run through that again. And our shortfall allowance for the property, we have deferred to the city's 7% for the subject property. Capitalization rates. Looking at my page number 18, again, we have the main market commercial realtor stats showing at the top. We have Class B office space. This would not be Class B, it would be Class C, but Class B office space. The market range that stated by the commercial realtors is roughly 6.5% up to 7.5% as a range. The subject property isn't a premium suburban office property. It is smaller, however, it's located in a heavy industrial area, not fronting on Waverly or Kenaston or Academy or Osborne or anything of that nature. Our office sale cap rate comps are shown at the bottom of page number 18. Not all of them are suburban, and we're looking at a range of 6.2% up to a 10% capitalization rate, that being for an older building. Generally, they're in that upper 6 into the 7% range, up to 7.9%. Many of these are obviously more significant investment properties, so they are being purchased by sophisticated investors that certainly do know what they're doing in their purchases, so the cap rates are indicative of the marketplace for office space. We've applied a 7.5% cap rate to the subject property. Again, that's taking into account the additional ongoing vacancy that they've had. That unit has been, as well as some of the other space, has been vacant for a considerable amount of time beyond the current assessment cycle. I don't know if I included that material here today or not, but that would be something that would be of concern to an investor and would be taken into account in the purchase price that they would pay, and of course the cap rate that would be resulting from that. As well, obviously there's a cost to renovating that main floor unit into a state where it would be rented at an appropriate modern market rent. So using our 7.5% cap rate, we come to a market value of $1,340,000. And that is my presentation. I think I've included the decision from the last cycle at the very back of the brief. And that's it.
Questions?
Yes. Since I've never been in the main floor, the basement, are those two spaces original then? Because it kind of looks like from the pictures that nothing's been done
Yes.
at all? Okay. And then, since it is quite a big site, are they using the back portion of it for anything, or is it just kind of there?
I honestly don't remember.
Yeah.
So Canterra is the tenant. I'm not sure if they have, I think they have some trucks on site there. If you look at the front photo, I don't know the extent of their use of the site, I'm afraid.
Okay, that's all my questions. Thank you.
Mr. Whitbread?
No, I'm fine, thank you.
Mr. Terriot?
So how long did you say this has been vacant? Number of years, you said?
Yes, it has been. Certainly that main floor and the basement have been vacant for a period of time, but they did put Canterra in to the spaces that they're in 2016, and they renovated the second floor for them. They left the basement as is, I believe. As I recall.
It is, I'm looking at the parcel of land, the ratio to a building, and it's a couple of acres. It's a nice piece of land. To what extent does that play on the cap rate? Because we talked
The
about the
amount of land.
building, but there's, you know, there's quite a, just looking at the land here, and there's a nice, and I think it's accessible quite well, so.
Yeah.
I was
That's
wondering
what it is.
to what extent that can play on the cap rate.
So typically so we're looking at it really is an office building that we're looking at here. There's 2,300 square feet of warehouse at the back, which is a function of what it was originally built for. In industrial terms, obviously, if you have an adequate or greater amount of land for yard storage and use, that does come into play. But we're really looking at dominantly an office building here. There is a small component of warehouse to it, but it's not that you're getting your main tenancies looking at this for their use of the yard space in manufacturing or such, right? They're office tenancies. So is it a plus? It's not a negative. I don't think it would add to it.
Land is never a
necessarily,
negative.
right? It's there, I'm not denying that, but it's at the back. You're not gonna build a different building on it or anything of that nature. It's developed at the front.
Yeah, and your rents, I tried because it's consolidated here and at $8. I think the city's at $9.86, from what I can figure out anyway, unless I made a mistake. So there's a couple of bucks difference here.
Yeah.
I'm not sure I grasped everything, but then, you know, the shortfall is a little different, but not much. But that's the main difference there, I guess. There's about $20,000 difference on the potential rental income.
Well, yeah, you're going to have, so there's the potential rent, which I definitely believe in. The non-recoverables obviously is an issue, and then we have a 7.5 cap rate. With regard to the rents, basement space, there is no strong demand out there in the market. I think our rate is higher than the city's. That main floor is not renting, it's not going to rent as it is. If it were to rent as it is, it would draw a well below market rate. $8 is certainly appropriate for that. We've applied a normal market rent of $12 a square foot for a second floor space, so we're not talking main floor space. The second floor, we applied $12 as the market rent to. They're paying right now $15.57 gross Canterra for the building, the spaces that they're in, $15.57 gross, so is $12 out of line? Probably not. And then the warehouse, $6. I think $6 is certainly appropriate for the space that it is. $8+ is, you wouldn't see it for this product.
Okay, that's all I have, Mr. Chairman.
Your shortfall, you've applied 7 across the board, whereas the city had 2 different figures.
I did, yes.
And why would you apply the same amount?
The size of the warehouse is pretty nominal in the relation to the building overall. The vacancy is going to be for the building as a whole at 7%. We treated the building as a single entity. We're not dividing it into income streams as the city does in their model.
Okay. Those are all my questions. That was easy. short pause while I get some necessary water here. I'm gonna tickle in my throat. Next is 695 Osborne Street. Santucci, when you are ready.
File number 19768, roll number 12010488000, address 695 Osborne Street. This is a two-story office building that was built in 2014. The leasable area is 3,142 square feet. If you turn to page 2, you can see some aerial shots of the subject property, just at the corner of Osborne Street and Strathgar Avenue, and this is located in South Osborne. On page 3, you can see some exterior photos. And on page 4, we have the request for information. Some sale properties, I'm assuming the one in 2010 was just for land value, that's why it's so low. The income stream is on page 5. So we have two separate spaces here. We have one space for the 1,279 square feet at $19.98, and we have one for 1,860 square feet at $20.14. So the overall rent per square foot is $20.07. For this property, for this OFS, we've applied the 5.5% vacancy loss, expenses at 2, shortfall at 7, and overall capitalization rate at 5.55%. My rent comparables are just at the bottom of the page here. I tried to pick rental comparables with actual year built after the year 2000, so all newer builds. They range from $16.50 to $22.75, with an average of $18.92 and a median of $18.76. On page 6 is just again the income value summary. 7 is our model derived capitalization rates. So this would be on the lowest end at the 5.55. Page 8 is the Municipal Assessment Act excerpts. On page 9 we come to the 2017 income and expense questionnaire. So for this property, it is gross, and part of the one floor is owner occupied. So we have 2 tenants with 0 vacancy, and there is 3 parking stalls at the rear, which I'm assuming are just for the tenants. If we can turn to page 11, we do have the Academy Athletic, what they're currently paying, which is gross at $33.23 a square foot. And then the second floor is occupied by the owner. Again, on page 13 is just my addenda information, page 15, additional capitalization rate evidence, and 16, the non-recoverable expense, additional information there. My recommendation today is to maintain the 2020 assessed value of the $1,031,000. Thank you. That's my presentation.
Mr. Smith, questions?
Yeah, just very briefly, and again, I recognize that we're not going to have time to go out and see all comparables, et cetera, but, so, I don't, this isn't about you, it's just the material that's here. Comparables number 5 and 6 at 865 Waverly, it's showing those as the 3rd floor of that building. Correct.
Comparables, which ones?
Sorry, it's your rent comparables on page number 5.
Okay, yes.
So the numbers 5 and 6 at
Yes.
865 Waverly on the 3rd floor.
I think they're units 104 and 101, so from my information on the main floor.
Okay, because the 3rd floor is owner occupied.
Okay.
It's indicating that it's floor 3, and those are.
Oh, we just have that, how many floors are in the building? I've just listed there. So it's a
Okay.
3, I should put stories, sorry.
Yeah, fair enough. So that particular property is we'll call it the KGS office building at the corner of Waverly and just west of the underpass there, correct?
Yes.
600 St. Anne's Road, that is a medical, medical office property, is it not?
I think there's different tenants. One of my tenants isn't medical. I think the other one might be massage, but the main floor one I chose was not.
Okay, I see. In the 870 Pembina Highway, that's the, essentially at the end of Taylor at Pembina on the east side with the law offices. It's kind of
It's a lot.
And the Taylor property would be those smaller office buildings built west of, say, Pan Am Pool on Taylor? Okay. That's all of my questions, thank you.
Mr. Whitbread?
Just clarify for me, please, on page 11 and your photo on page 3. So as I looked at the photo on page 3, it looks like 3 stories to the building. And then I look at page 11, and it shows that 1,300 is leased by Academy Athletic and 1,439 leased by the owner. Am I missing something in the way of another roughly 1,300 or 1,400 square feet?
I'm unsure. I thought maybe the ceilings, but it does look like a 3-story building.
Looks
We
like the
currently have it as
floors.
2 stories, and this was recently added, so
But your wall height is
we only have the 2
16,
tenants.
eh?
Yeah,
Do you know that?
I'm unsure. I didn't add the building, but maybe, yeah, the appellant would have more of a,
That's where I was going
Yeah.
incorrectly. Have you been to the building?
I've never been there.
So you haven't been inside, you can't
No.
comment on
I
that.
think the last person in there was the person who added it to the building.
Maybe we can wait,
Yeah.
we get to that.
Sorry.
No worries, thank you.
Mr. Telio?
Yeah, I was looking at that as well. There's only 2,739 square feet occupied out of 3,142, so I don't know where the other 300 was, I guess. We've got no answer for that?
We might be getting one.
Okay. I'll see, I want to see what the city has to say. It's about 400 square
Possibly a
feet.
mezzanine,
400 square feet,
but I'm unsure.
approximately.
Yeah.
That's all I have. Thank you.
Your combined, get this right, the blended rate, 2007?
Yes, so very close to the middle of both of them.
Right. Your comps, though, come out
Yes.
lower than that.
Yes, they're a bit lower, and I don't know if it's just based on age and why our model drive rate would be a bit higher. Also based on the quality of the interior. I've never been in the building, but from what I read, it's quite nice.
You selected the comps
Yes,
based on a combination of which factors?
mostly the age of the building, the size of the building, location.
Okay. That was all my questions for Mr. Whitbread, sorry.
Looking at the sold information in 2010 for 300,000, my memory is that this is an older building, it was demolished and this building was built in its place. Any information available from you, the city, about the permits and the cost of structuring this?
I didn't include the permits, but I think it was around, actually, I'd probably confuse it with another building. I'm not sure of the total cost of construction. I can't provide the exact number.
Okay, thank you. No further questions.
Okay. Mr. Smith?
So you're right, this, this was where Ronald's Shoes was on South Osborne there. I went there many times as a kid, long ago. To solve the size issue, look at my page number 5. and the bottom picture. So there's not 3 full stories there, it's a mezzanine space. So that picture is taken from the top of the mezzanine stairs looking down onto the 2nd floor. So the actual rentable area does come to, I think it's the 3140, is it not? 3140 square feet. So you've got 1,300 on the main, whatever the 2nd floor is, very similar to that, and then the mezzanine space. So it comes out to the 3140 in total. That's what you're looking at. The building was newly built in 2015. 3,140 square feet. It was reduced in the last cycle, as you can see on my page number 1. We were lower than that in our valuation, but it was accepted at that time. The main floor has a massage tenancy in it, so it's essentially a retail type space. And the 2nd floor and the mezzanine are occupied by the owner of the building itself. So you can see the photos running through the top of page 4, that's the main floor. Then we have the hallway, or rather the stairwell to get up to the 2nd floor. There is no elevator access to the 2nd floor space. And then there's the interior stairwell to get to the mezzanine space there as well. You can see the build out. It is a modern facility. Description is on page 7 if you wish to go through it. And the site is shown at the bottom of page 8. There's parking for about 3 cars at the rear, and the location is shown on page number 9. So if you know where the Park Theater is, this is across the road from that, in that Riverview, Lord Roberts area. So that's the property that we're looking at. Let's look at the valuation. Subject property has the main floor tenant in on a gross lease at $33.23 per square foot, 43,200 gross, and then you have the owner occupied portion of the 2nd floor and the mezzanine space. So what would be appropriate for these spaces? Obviously, the gross number is well above market. We provide our rental comps for office space at the bottom of page 12. Again, we can go through those if you wish. I also present our own Cushman & Wakefield 2nd quarter 2018 office market beat publication at the top. It's indicating Class C suburban space at $11.61 per square foot. Now this is a newer building, etc. Well located on Osborne. Countering that, we're looking at 2nd floor space with no elevator access and very limited parking as well, with only 3 spots on site. Typically for office space, you're going to need parking for the tenants. Beyond that, certainly the tenant on the main floor requires that. Requires on-site parking for their retail tenancies as well. So three spots is not going to provide you a lot of parking. That's certainly an issue when you're looking at the rental rate. So $33.23 gross, deducting stabilized operating expenses, this comes down to just under $23 a square foot on a net basis. We've applied $23 a square foot to the main floor tenant. It is a retail type space and it's decently located, so we feel that that is appropriate. Again, looking at the second floor and mezz, it is a walk-up. It is nicely built out. There's no dispute there. Again, however, very limited parking on site, no elevator access, etc. So it's not going to be at the market average of $11.61, but it's not going to command a really high rental rate either. They've built it out for themselves essentially. So we've applied an above-market rate of $13 a square foot to that second floor and mezz space, as you can see on my page 13. And this gives us a potential annual income of $53,820. To this, we've applied a 7% vacancy allowance, certainly reflective of market vacancy. If you look at the stats at the top of the page, there's a reason that we're at that level. Our expense allowance includes the 5% non-recoverable, and the 2% non-recoverable structural. In our allowance, in our valuation rather, as well as the city's shortfall of $7 a square foot. I think the actual operating expenses were over 10 for the property, so in this case we've deferred to the city's $7 shortfall rate. Capitalization rate. So we're looking at a suburban office building with main floor retail, essentially investment grade properties as quoted by Cushman, Colliers, and C.B. Richard Ellis for suburban office are ranging in that 6.5 to 7.5% range. We present our office sale comparables at the bottom of page 17. Subject property, newly built, well located, relatively small, so there will be some demand there. It will be at the lower end of that range, so we're using a 6.5% cap rate. The 5.55% cap rate that's used by the city of Winnipeg, and I didn't ask this question, but it's at the very bottom end of their capitalization rate chart. They have no lower office rate, so essentially this would be the peak of the market as far as office properties in Winnipeg go. We just don't believe that to be the case. It will have more demand given the size of it, but very limited on-site parking, no elevator access, etc. It's a 6.5 cap, so our final market value is $692,000. Thank you.
Questions?
Yes, I was just wondering what the unit numbers were for comparables 2 and 4, because I couldn't find those specific units for that rate.
Which one are we looking at here?
I'm on
page
page
12. I do not have the actual unit numbers. I quoted the building as a whole. Well, that's not to say we don't have the unit numbers. We do, but in what I've shown here, it's the building number rather than the unit itself. So I'm afraid I don't have that in front of me today.
And the rest of the comparables are quite well dated compared to the subject property.
In terms of the age built?
Yes. And overall condition.
Well, so we have 525 Academy is property right by the train tracks on the way to Kenniston on the north side. It has undergone renovation. I believe it's Frank, he's a realtor that owns that and has renovated it. 725 Corridon, 87, yes, it's not built in 2015, but it's not a really old property. The two on Spurfield are not from the 70s either. It's difficult to have comps from all new ones, unfortunately.
And then in regards to the vacancy, so the subject property currently has 0% vacancy, and you've utilized the 7%, but you didn't take into account that the overall urban was 6.2 and maybe lower it due to the fact that they are experiencing 0% vacancy.
Sorry, I don't mean to get you to go through that unnecessarily. The overall average of 6.2?
Yeah, so on
We-
your page, I think you have, your overall suburban vacancy from Cushman Wakefield is 6.2%. And I was just wondering why maybe you didn't go with the lower end of vacancy, considering the subject has 0.
Right. So, I guess a couple of reasons. So, just looking at, yes, there's the Cushman, and that is accurate for that classification on the properties that are studied. We also have the Collier's material there as well. The suburban overall between the two is showing 6.2 to 8. 7% is reasonable. You could certainly use 6. If you look at the property, it's basically a 2-unit building, so if the main floor goes vacant, you're 50% vacant, so that would, over a time span, add up, of course.
Thank you, that's my question.
Mr. Whitford?
No, thank you.
Mr. Tierney?
I just had one, you mentioned these 3 parking stalls, but I'm looking in the picture. Do you know what parking is on the street next to it? There's many of these places where, if I look at the first page, you can see here, the car is parked, and sometimes there's quite a bit of parking on the street and close by. So I didn't know if you could comment on that. You've commented on the 3 stalls, but not
yes.
on the other possibilities.
Sure. Let's talk about that. So yes, there's street front parking on Osborne. If you look at the top of
Front
page
parking
2.
as well?
If you look at the top of page 2 there, you can actually see the pole where the parking ends, right in front of that Balmoral Laundry. So you can park on Osborne on that side of the street up to that pole. You can park on the other side of Osborne, of course, as well, within the bounds. And you can park on the side street, but not directly beside the building, if I recall. It starts after the back lane. So yes, there's parking there, but as far as tenants paying rent for a building, obviously they're going to want to park on site. In most locations, there's going to be parking available for them in a parking lot, but when there's 3 stalls, it's pretty limited, particularly with an owner occupant on 1 floor or 2.
That's all I have, Mr. Chairman.
Looking at the vacancy that you applied, the 7%, that's typical, you're saying. Typical based on buildings that are a little more than a little more than half owner occupied?
No,
Or
that
not?
would be an overall market
That's an
average for the classes that we're showing there. So, no, I'm not specifically looking at owner occupied. I mean, if you look at owner occupied buildings, there's no vacancy, right? Until they go out of business or whatnot, then it's 100% vacant, right? So that's why there's always a vacancy rate that's applied in valuations, is that there's always a vacancy always needs to be accounted for. So yes, there's owner occupant in more than half of this building, but that also being said, we're looking at a main floor retail tenants, and retail tenants come and go on a fairly regular basis.
Would that location and type of building result in retail vacancies of a substantial amount?
It's a newer building. It's an interesting area. It's and I've always lived in St. Patel, so I go through here all the time and see the changes. You have mainly older buildings on the park in that section of the property, so that section of Osborne. So this is newer. However, it's on the west side. If you look to what it's next to Balmoral Laundry, that's been there probably since the 60s or somewhere there. It has never changed. There's a lot of older apartment buildings that have some main floor retail that comes and goes. If you look at some of the tenancies in there, I know there's a restaurant that has gone out of business at least 3 times that's had renovated space right next to this, basically. So, yeah, they do come and go. The older tenants on the other side where they're paying, you know, very little for the used bookstore or something, they've been there for a very long time. They're paying appropriate rents for the type of space they're in, so it's a bit different for one like this. Not a lot to compare it to right there.
All right, thank you. That's all my questions. Anybody need a short break, deal with parking like I do for a second? If you don't mind, I will just deal with parking.
Pretty important.
Okay, let's move on to 430 Dovercourt Drive.
This is file number 19-1554, rule number 03065156300, address 430 Dovercourt Drive. This is a one-story office building. The leasable area is 16,290 square feet. We have 2 actual year builds, 2 effective year builds, so I'm assuming there was, it has to do with the fact that there's 2 separate buildings here. If you look to page 2, you can kind of see from my aerial shots. There's the building closer to the front of the property on Dovercourt, and then the building in the rear. Just have some exterior photos as well. On page 3, just to show the request for income information and responses. There's no subject sale history, and the subject property leases I'll go through on the income expense questionnaire submitted. So for my income stream, I have 3 premises. I have one premise for 3,950 square feet, and that one is at $12.79. One at 2,700 square feet for $13.20, and one at 9,640 square feet for $11.94. So the overall rental rate per square foot is $12.36. So for this property, we have the vacancy loss of 5.5%, expenses at 2%, shortfall at $7, and the overall capitalization rate of 6.55%. If you turn to page 5, I have about 24 comparables here. Tried to locate ones closer to the subject property. Some of them are older, 1966 builds, and then 1964 I think is actually older, and then some of the newer ones from the 1990s all the way up to, I think, 22 is from 2001. My average is $13.08, and my median is $13.04, which is just a bit higher than what was used for the subject property. If we turn to page 6, just the breakdown of the income summary there. Page 7 is the capitalization rates. Page 8, again, the Municipal Assessment Act excerpts. And then page 9 is the start of the 2017 income and expense questionnaire. Shows the property is total leasable of 16,340 square feet with 0 vacancy and 3 tenants. If we turn to page 11, we have the rent provided of about $198,000, and I think we have it at about $201,000. For the NOI they've provided here in income expense, it's $193,000 approximately, and I think for our overall, we use the net operating income for the model of $180,000. So theirs was just a bit, well, about 13,000 higher than what we have. For this one here, it also shows, I should point out on page 11, they do recover some of the management fee, and then it says here that they also have a non-recoverable expense for $9,600. So I'm not sure if certain tenants are paying it or what that would be there. On page 15, I have the 3 tenants that are currently at this location. The first tenant pays rent per square foot of $12. The second one there pays $12, and then the third one pays $12.75. And again, there's no vacancy. Page 20 is the start of the addenda that's provided, again with the additional cap rate evidence and the non-recoverable expense information. And my recommendation today is to maintain the 2020 assessed value of $2,750,000. Thank you. That's my presentation.
Mr. Smith?
I have no questions, thank you.
Mr. Whitbread?
No questions, thank you.
Mr. Terrier?
No questions, thank you.
Oh my.
No, okay, I have to think of something.
You don't have to.
Not that comes to mind. Leave it there. Mr. Smith?
Okay, 430 Dovercourt. So, as indicated, there are 2 buildings on site. If you look at my page 7, you can see an aerial of it. And the building fronting on Dovercourt is all office. The building at the back certainly has office in it, and then it has a larger portion of warehouse in that building at the rear. You look at the aerial as well, and you look at the parking situation, and I think we may even have photos of this, I'm not sure. Obviously, the front building has good parking there, certainly adequate. The one at the rear, the parking is split between the sides, and you have the warehouse access, so for deliveries, etc., on one side where some of the parking is, which is why the majority of the cars are parked on the other side in a very kind of cramped spaces. So, just one thing to look at. The building itself, total leasable area of 16,340 square feet according to the leases in place. Land to plan area ratio of 3.2 to 1. The photographs start on page 2. You can see the exterior parking that I was discussing on the bottom of page 2 there, the front office building, right of the rear office building at the top, unit 440. Then you can see the interiors of the office space as well as the warehouse, pretty straightforward. The rents that are in place for the subject property are shown at the top of my page 11. $12, $12 and $12.75. $12.75 being for the front building. So our overall annual rent of $199,043. We do present rent comparables for that. We do believe they're at market levels, so we've used the in-place rent. I believe it's ever so slightly different than the city's estimated rent in this case. The expense side of the equation, again, we're using 7% vacancy. Keep in mind here, we have a significant portion of the overall built structure being that warehouse space as shown in the photographs as well. It's not all office space. So we've applied 7% vacancy here. Our expense allowance remains the same with the 5% and the 2%, and the shortfall of $7 per square foot is appropriate for the subject property too, looking at the expenses. So our NOI comes to $166,433. If you look at my page number 15, now I would just draw your attention to that. So what I've shown here is our valuation down to the NOI in the left-hand side. Middle is City of Winnipeg 2020, that should say 2020. And the right-hand side is City of Winnipeg 2018. So
Just before you go farther, on that table, is
Yeah.
shortfall amount $5 or is it $7 as in the text?
did I apply $5 or? It looks like I applied $5 per square foot as a rate in between the office and office and industrial. $5 was applied. My apologies, not 7. So again, just getting back to page 15 there, you can see our valuation compared to the 2020 city, very close in terms of potential rent. City of Winnipeg slightly lower in 2018, so understandable. Vacancy dropping from 7% to 5.5% in the city's valuation model. And then we have the significant drop of 7% to 2% with the shortfall remaining the same. All told there with an initial 5%, or rather roughly $5,000 difference in potential rent, we have roughly $19,000 difference in net income in model between 2018 and 19. A lot of that is coming directly from the change in the expense allowance, plus a slight difference in the vacancy. Now, moving on to capitalization rate, we've covered this ground a number of times. We're looking at 6.75, or rather 6.5 roughly to 7.5% in cap rates from the major market participants for suburban class B. We have property that's well located, well constructed, a good portion of it being warehouse located at the rear. Some challenges with regard to accommodating parking on site. Our cap rate comps shown on page 16 for office, not all being directly comparable, but giving you an indication of what is paid regarding cap rate for office in the city. We're looking at a low of 6.2 up to that 7.98% range roughly, with some variation there obviously. Again, subject property, good portion of it is industrial as well. If you look at the city's cap rate model information as well, industrial is also higher. This would not be premium industrial, being located at the back of the site. We've applied a 7% cap rate, right in the middle essentially of what is being proposed by market participants and certainly what our cap rates are indicating. So this gives us a market value of $2,378,000. And I'm open for questions.
Ms. Santucci?
So your net operating income is quite different from the actual net operating income that they provided on their statement. Did you look more into the income and expense in regards to that?
So The rent that they received at the end of 2017 was ever so slightly under what I have shown. And their expenses are there for everybody to see. Again, we're looking at a situation where we have to model these properties for assessment, so you do need to take into account vacancy as well as non-recoverable expenses. For a single year, their non-recoverable expenses may not be that high. They're $9,600, I see. But again, we're looking at the overall time horizon, not a one-year snapshot.
And then for this property, the value that your final estimate value today is less than 2018. Did you appeal that to the municipal board?
No, they decided not to appeal that themselves. Our value for 2018 was lower than what we're proposing in 2020.
Thank you, that's all my questions.
Mr. Whitbread?
I may have missed this, but your cap rate is 7% for this specific property. Is there a particular element of the property that would ask for that 7.0? Condition, age? What are you suggesting?
No, it's not condition and age. It's the market evidence that we're presenting. So our cap rate comps that we present at the bottom of page 16, while these are straight office, not directly comparable, they're pointing at higher caps. If you look at the market participants at the top and their impressions of capitalization rates for investment grade properties, again, they're looking at that 6.5 to 7.5 range roughly for suburban class B, which is what this would fall within. 6.5 being the low end, 6.75 for Cushman to 7.5, 6.5 to 7.25 for Collier's CBRE, 7 to 7.5. We have a property that has, 3,000 or 4,000 square feet of industrial component warehouse at the back, with some challenged parking and loading. 7% is certainly within the realm. It's in the middle there. It's well located in Fort Garry. I don't deny that. It's not a bad office building, but the market evidence is supportive of the 7.
Thank you. No further questions.
Mr. Chevrier?
No questions, thank you.
One question. In the addendum material you provided on page 3 above the large photograph there, it says Winnipeg continues to offer some of the lowest office occupancy costs in Canada. Our developing infrastructure, stable economy, and wide variety of office space offering presents great opportunity for businesses considering opening offices in the city. When they talk about low office occupancy costs, are they also including non-recoverable costs, or how broad a brush might that be addressing?
Just caught up to your page here, so can you point me to what you were reading?
The last paragraph starts with Winnipeg.
Mm-hmm.
Winnipeg continues to offer some of the lowest office occupancy costs in Canada.
Right. Developing infrastructure, right. No, that would not take into account the non-recoverable occupancy costs, because those would not be paid by the tenants. So stating there's the lowest office occupancy costs in Canada, that's the ones that they would actually pay, the recoverable ones.
Okay, thank you. All my questions.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
That concludes our hearing. We will take a short break and deliberate.
We're gonna work. Oh, we've been working anyway, but we work more. Richard?
You bet.